All right, we left off with part one of our discussion talking about the basics of Revit, how it differs from the workflow we use in AutoCAD. And we got into a little bit of a discussion about how the user interface works, which we're going to expand on today a little bit. But first, let's go ahead and do just a little bit of follow-up from our first discussion. First of all, be thinking about what the main differences are between AutoCAD and Revit. Remember that AutoCAD is a two-dimensional drafting tool primarily. Revit is all done in 3D. AutoCAD, we're drawing the lines that are ultimately going to be represented in the sheets that we produce. In Revit, we're modeling, and we're taking from that model cuts through the building or images from projected away from the building to generate our views. The primary advantage of that, of course, is that when you make a change to the building, all of the views that are affected by that change are automatically updated. We also want to make sure that everybody understood and is up to speed with the user interface in terms of opening and saving projects. When we click on the Open tool, we're presented with this window, and remember that we have this shortcut bar over here on the left-hand side, and that shortcut bar, I'm having trouble saying that, is instrumental in speeding up the process of opening and saving files. Any folder that we navigate to, and sometimes folders are difficult to navigate to, but once we get there, we can find that folder and just drag it and drop it into this list. I typically like to use and keep the folders that I most frequently use near the top of that list, but obviously you can adjust where each of those folders resides, and you can even right-click on them and remove them if you find that you just don't, there's some in there that you just don't need or want. Another thing that everybody should be up to speed on before we go much farther is making sure that the software is installed correctly. Obviously, you wouldn't be probably following along with this if you didn't at least have Revit installed. But if you did have trouble with that, right on the home page here, there's instructions on how to get that done. And then there's also right underneath that practice files download page. Now make sure that when you navigate to that page, you're downloading the most current version of those files so that they line up with the version of Revit that you're using. And then finally, the Revit content library. You won't probably need this week, but at some point you're going to need to make sure that that Revit content library is installed, and I'll take just a minute to make sure that everybody understands what that means. So sometimes we have to bring new things into Revit. You can see that this window that I'm clicking on here, this is a casement 3x3 with trim, but in some cases I don't have all of the components in my project that I need, and so I need to load new components. Typically that's going to be done from the Insert tab and the Load Family button. So go ahead and click on that and just make sure that you are taken to a folder that looks similar to this. So we're going to have an English Imperial and then a US underneath that, and that should have a bunch of folders in there. If you don't have that, if when you navigate to this folder here, you're not finding that library, we will need to go out and install that manually. And you can do that by clicking on this link right here, which is going to take you to the folder. And again, just make sure that you're installing the one for the current version that you're using of Revit. And then lastly, as far as the follow-up stuff goes, make sure that you're spreading out and expanding things so that you can see them easily. And that's not only true for the properties and the project browser, which was demonstrated in the part one video, how we can sort of spread those things out, but also any of the pop-up windows that come up. For example, if we click on Edit Type, let's go ahead and just edit the type of window here. This window that shows up, remember all of these little pop-ups that we get in Revit can be expanded. So we can kind of expand these things out. Don't fight with them with a little tiny interface like this where you have to do a bunch of scrolling and things like that. Just go ahead and use that screen. We're going to be closing this thing when we're done with it anyway, so we might as well make it as big as we need. And you should only have to do that once. It should retain that size the next time you go to access that window. Okay, the book takes you on a fairly detailed tour through the user interface, but I do just want to mention all of the various components of your screen, and then we'll kind of take a look at how we're going to best navigate the project once we get to that point. So we'll start up here at the top. This is the quick access toolbar, and these are intended to be the most frequently used tools, right? And so there's a number of things up here like the measure tool and the default 3D view, and a few other things like dimensions that we can use, print, save as, things like that. You may have things up there that you don't need, but it's kind of out of the way, so I usually just leave that alone. The only thing that I do sometimes is add a couple of things. If you have some things that you like to do from the Quick Access Toolbar that you do all the time that's not checked currently, you can certainly go in and put a check mark next to it. And if you don't see the thing that you want up there, you can always dig in and customize the Quick Access Toolbar by clicking on this tool right here. But we're not going to go through a detailed explanation of that right now. The next thing underneath that, the obvious thing up here, we call this the ribbon. And the ribbon, that's terminology that really comes from Microsoft, but a lot of software across the industry and across all industries really are going to that ribbon style. And the ribbon style is contextual in that each tab across the top here defines which ribbon is going to be displayed at any given time. So we have an architecture ribbon, a structure ribbon, steel precast systems, all the way on and on and on. The most frequently ones you're going to probably be using are going to be under the Modify tab, which oftentimes does come up automatically when a command is active, and the Architecture tab, where primarily we're going to be going to create new things. We already introduced the Properties palette and the Project Browser in the previous discussion. Just keep in mind that all of these things in the Project Browser can be expanded open, and we can access all of these individual views. The Project Browser primarily consists of all the various views that you have in your project, and then also the sheets that you have. And we'll go ahead and introduce those a little bit in more detail later in the discussion. The Properties palette is also dynamic in that it changes based on what you have selected or don't have selected. So right now we have nothing selected. We don't have any components selected and highlighted. Therefore, what the Properties palette is showing us is the properties for the current view, which is the default 3D view right now. As soon as we select a component though, then the Properties palette is going to update, and it's going to show us all the properties for that component or multiple components. If we have multiple components selected, it's going to be giving us the properties, in this case the instance properties, for those walls that I just selected. Keep in mind that those properties can be changed. All of these things are parameters in that, anything that's not grayed out can actually be changed, and the properties of that object would then be changed, and that's true for multiple objects as well. So if, for example, we wanted this top constraint on those walls that we have selected to be higher than the rest of them, we could give them a 10-foot offset, and all 4 or 6 or however many of those walls we have selected there are going to pop up a little bit higher than the rest of them. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. We'll be talking about modifying existing components here in another discussion. Another thing to keep in mind is that the properties are shown here are instance properties, but each one of these components, every component in your model, also has what we call type properties. And to access those, we actually have to dig into this button right here, Edit Type. But in that expanded now user interface, we have access to all the individual type properties for those objects or for that object. We're going to talk a little bit more in a future discussion the difference between a type property and an instance property. The name kind of gives it away, but we'll get into that discussion another time. Occasionally I get a question from students, so I'll just go ahead and tell you now, and if I need to remind you later, that's fine. But sometimes people accidentally close one of these interfaces, either the Project Browser or the Properties palette. And in that case, I just want to demonstrate how we can get that thing back open. So if I accidentally, for example, click on this X and close my Project Browser, how do I get that back? To get that back, really in most of the other user interfaces, we can go to the View tab, and then right here there's a User Interface drop down. And you can see right here that the Project Browser now is unchecked. If we go ahead and check that, it'll just bring it right back. And then we can stretch and readjust the width of that thing as needed. So the View tabs are listed across the top of our main model viewing area. We could sort of think of this as model space, right? But as we open additional views, like for example, if I double click on floor 1 here, that'll open it up, and you'll see that that now has a new tab. The 3D view that we were looking at before remains open, and so we can easily switch between our views just by clicking on the tab that we want. And there's really no limit to how many views we can have open at once. We can, and we often find that as we're working on a project, we open a lot of different views because modeling requires us to look at our model from different directions, right? To make sure that we have things right. It's very common to have to switch between views very frequently when we're modeling. And it's good practice to do that because when we draw something or when we create something in Revit, we don't know what it looks like from the other directions, right? The wall could be inside out, it could be not tall enough, it could be too low into the ground, things like that, that you really can't tell by looking at a plan view. So sometimes we have to switch to a section view or an elevation view to really see what's going on. So we end up with a lot of tabs that are open, and the more tabs we have open, the harder it is to sort of navigate from one place to the next within our model because you're looking through and reading all of these tabs. So sometimes what is a good idea is just to clear out those tabs, get to the view that you want to see, and then close all the other ones. That's quickly done just by clicking on this Close Inactive Views button right here in the Quick Access toolbar. You'll also find that over here on the View tab. And that basically is just going to close everything except for the current view. I'm going to go ahead and open up Floor 1 view again. And we're just going to click on this wall tool. And the purpose of this operation is not to show you how to create a wall so much as it is to talk about the options bar. The options bar shows up right here under the ribbon, and it turns green, and that shows up depending on what operation or what tool you're using. So in the case of creating a wall, we click on the wall tool and it's ready to create a wall, but you can see on this options bar there's all sorts of parameters that you have to think about and set before you start drawing that wall, because things like where it is relative to your cursor. Are you drawing from the center of the wall, the edge, the someplace in between? How tall is that wall? Where does it start? Where does it end? Things like that. So there's a lot of different options up here that show up, and that's our options bar. So don't want to go much deeper than that into it. I just wanted to demonstrate that that thing is dynamic. It's not always there, and it will change based on what you're doing. The best way to terminate a command, and I think we get into this in the next chapter, is to click on the Modify tool right here. And anything that you have going on would just basically go back to its neutral state. Deselects everything and it stops any active commands. Now Revit doesn't have a command prompt per se like AutoCAD does, but it is always listening, and most of the commands you're going to find have a shortcut, and you can see that demonstrated in the flyout here. You can see that this is the wall tool. The shortcut is WA. But unlike AutoCAD, Revit actually is listening to what you're typing, and you do not have to hit enter for it to understand. In other words, if we type WA right now, it's going to initiate the wall command. Go ahead and try it, WA, and you can see immediately it goes into wall creation mode. And then also there is a status bar, sorry I couldn't think of the word, down at the bottom that functions very much like the command prompt. And I'm not sure if you'll be able to see it on my screen, but if you look down at the bottom, it should say click to enter wall start point. So if you ever get stuck, or if you're not sure what Revit is expecting as far as an input, you can just glance down there. It's the very bottom left of your screen, and Revit will be prompting you, providing you're not hovering over something. Revit will prompt you for what it's looking for next. Going back to the view tabs for just a minute, and I will open just a few more views just to kind of have a few tabs open. It is possible to view more than one view at a time, or look at more than one view at a time. We talked a little bit in the previous discussion about using multiple monitors, which I can't really demonstrate in this recording, but if you have more than one monitor set up, you can actually drag these views off of the main window, and they just sort of become their own windows, and you can put them onto another screen if you want to. So in that way you can kind of be looking at two views at the same time. They can't both be active at the same time, but they will update in real time for any changes that you make. So sometimes that's handy when you're looking at something, say, in an elevation view and in a plan view at the same time. Bringing this back is a little bit trickier, but you just have to make sure to drop it at the top here, and it'll reintegrate it with the rest of the tabs. Another interesting trick, if you only have one screen and you want to tile multiple views, it will tile all of the views that are currently open into an arrangement within that drawing area. And that tool is on the View tab and the Tile Views button right here. And basically it just breaks it down into 4 separate things. Unfortunately, to get that back to the original, you sort of have to manually drag and drop all of these back into the same place, which is a little bit cumbersome. It's giving me a little trouble right now. I think you have to, yeah, grab that. Okay, so we got it back. There's no easy way to sort of untab the views once you've tiled them. All right, I just switched to a south elevation view. You can zoom in on this view and you can kind of see all of the detail. Sometimes though, and I have this already enabled, so you can't really see any line weight variation here. But this tool right here that I keep up in my quick access toolbar is called Thin Lines. And Thin Lines is something that I usually, when I'm drafting, leave on. And it just allows me to see all of the detail that I might not be able to see when all of the lines are displayed at their regular thickness, or the thickness that they would be printed at. So keep in mind that this Thin Line tool is there, but you can also toggle it off to get a sense of, you know, how this thing is actually going to print. This is actually a real-time print preview for you, and it will change based on the scale, the drawing scale that you have set. For example, if I change this to 1/4 inch, you're going to notice that the lines appear to get thinner, but really what's happening is the overall size of the view on the sheet would get bigger. And relative to that size change, the lines look thinner, but they're really not. They would, regardless of the scale that we printed it at, the lines would typically look the same. It would just be harder to see on a smaller scale print. So that scale that I just set down here, this bar right here, is called the View Control Bar. And for obvious reasons, this is going to set all the various display options, except for thin lines, right? That's not down there for whatever reason, but because that's universal, that will control any view that you're looking at. But all of the other things down here are specific to the view that you have current. So in other words, if I change the scale when I have the south elevation view current, it's not going to change the scale for any of my other views. It's just affecting that, and that's true with all of these tools. So let's take a look at some of the other ones. The one right next to the scale is called the detail level. Right now it's set to coarse, and basically you have 3 settings for any view. You can have it coarse, medium, and fine, and that's just going to adjust how much detail you're able to see, how simplified or how detailed you want a particular view to look. And there are various reasons for that we'll get into a discussion later on, but just understand that that's where we would set that. In most cases, we're going to have our view detail set to fine. Right next to that, similar but different, this is actually the visual style. And you can see that the default in most cases is going to be hidden line, which is exactly what we typically are going to want. But we can switch that also to something called wireframe. There's a few cases where we might do that. Where you actually basically have X-ray vision. Now you can see right through the building. All of the lines are represented, so the edges of walls and the edges of objects and things, those are all shown, but we can also see right through surfaces. So obviously that gets a little bit confusing and hard to look at. So we typically are going to leave that on hidden line, but we also have an option to display it as shaded, which is going to give us sort of a cartoonish look at what that might look like with the textures applied. And then as we move further down in that list, it gets more and more realistic. So consistent colors basically just takes away the shading from that last view, but it's still kind of shaded without shadows. And then we get down into textures, and that's where it kind of shifts over to more of a semi-rendered view, where it's a little bit more realistic in how the surfaces look. It's taking those materials that are applied to those various components, and it's representing them in a more photorealistic way. And then down at the bottom of that list, and this is results may vary, folks, so just depending on how robust your graphics card is on your computer, you may experience an extreme slowdown when you shift to this view. I certainly do. But it'll take and render that even with more detail. So if you just kind of need a preview of what this thing is going to look like, and I realize we haven't really talked about rendering at all yet, but you can get some pretty photorealistic imagery out of Revit by doing a rendering, and this is just sort of like a real-time preview of that. I don't use it all that often. I typically I'm just gonna leave it on hidden line because for drafting that's the most useful. Okay, let's talk a little bit about navigating the project. So we've already explored how to switch from one view to another. We just double click on it and open up that new view, and then we can switch between those open views by just clicking on the various tabs across the top. When we're in the view, navigation is pretty straightforward, and fortunately it's very similar to AutoCAD and how that works. So we know that we have the pan and the zoom, and that's our scroll wheel. Make sure, if you're not already doing it, make sure you're using a mouse with a scroll wheel and a clickable scroll wheel. So when you push down on that scroll wheel, it should click, and that allows us to drag the view left and right. Now we're not actually moving any geometry, we're really just moving ourselves back and forth, right? But this allows us to pan across and see different things on the drawing, and that's most useful when you're zoomed in. And that's the other thing the scroll wheel does. When we roll it forward, we're going to zoom in, and we roll it back, we're going to zoom out. Now a lot of times I can avoid using pan altogether because the zoom feature is directional relative to where the cursor is located. So in other words, if I move my cursor over here and I zoom out, everything's going to sort of zoom out toward the cursor. And if I move my cursor over here, say I want to zoom in on the stairwell, I just have to position my cursor at the stairwell before I roll the scroll wheel forward again, and it'll take me right there. So you can pretty quickly, if you get a good roll on your scroll wheel, zoom out and zoom back in all in one motion without ever having to pan. But if you get in and you just need to move over just a little bit, pan is sometimes useful to just kind of drag the view across. Okay, let's take a look at one more feature, and this is only available in a 3D view. So either switch to your 3D view here, or you could switch to your default 3D view here, or you could click on your default 3D view in the quick access toolbar. But in any case, get to this view, and then this is going to be similar to pan. Pan and zoom works in 3D also, so we can pan and zoom. But the pan tool, if you're holding down the shift key, turns into a orbit tool. Now it's not rotate, we're actually orbiting around this model, because again, we're not changing the position of the model at all. We're just moving our position relative to the model. Okay, but you can see that by holding the shift key and the scroll wheel button, we're able to navigate around a 3D model. Again, that's not going to do anything in a two-dimensional view like a plan view or an elevation view. This is only useful in a 3D view. But we can also directionally zoom in and out on things. And so get yourself familiar with that if you're not already. Make sure that you take a minute and build some muscle memory relative to that, because it does make working in Revit a lot easier if that becomes second nature to you. We also have the view cube and the navigation bar up here, and those are other ways that we can sort of navigate through our different views. Typically most useful in a 3D view, maybe even only available in a 3D view, but if you click on the various highlighted elements of the view cube, it'll take you to a isometric view of that space. So if I want to look at this directly from the front, I can just click on this. It'll automatically reposition the model so that I'm looking directly at it in a 3D view. I can click the corner, and it's going to take me to sort of a 45 isometric view of it. I can switch to a top view, so forth and so on, right? And the directions are also, these different arrows are kind of doing similar things with this. We also have this navigation wheel, and this thing is a little bit clunky. It comes in handy when we're setting up rendering views, which we're going to get to on another date, but if you want to play around with this, you can see that this has various tools on it. It's just a little bit difficult to get used to. The way this works is you actually have to click in the tool that you want to use and hold, and then move your cursor. So I'm panning right now. Right here I'm orbiting. Okay, so if you don't want to do that shift mouse wheel thing, you could do it this way instead. We also have zoom, which you can go just sort of in and out. It's not directional though, so not really all that useful. We also have walk, center, look, and up, down. I'll let you guys sort of experiment with those as you like, but I'm going to close this for now just by clicking on this little X. And then the last thing we'll talk about in this category is right-clicking. Right-clicking on things gives you a lot of different options, and we're familiar with right-clicking because we do it a lot in other applications. But if I hover over this wall, for example, and I right-click, you can see it gives me this context menu, and I have all kinds of different things that I can do with that. One of the most useful ones is this hide in view. If I need to hide an element, for example, I can just click on hide in view element, and it just kind of disappears. To redisplay that, I have to click on this light bulb, which is reveal hidden elements. And then in that case, if I wanted to unhide it, I would right click and say unhide in view elements. Another thing we can do with that right click tool is we can create a new thing. So we can say create similar. And so that would set me up to create a wall of the exact same type as the one I just clicked on. And obviously there are quite a few other things that we can do with that right click, but just be aware that that's a thing, and it is a quick way to do things. I find that a lot quicker than some other ways of doing those things. Over here in the project browser, we can also rename these views if we don't like the way that Revit sort of defaults to naming views. We can certainly rename those to whatever we want. Again, you're going to right click on the thing, and down here you can see that it's renamed. You can also delete, you can duplicate, a lot of other things that you can do with those. But we're getting a little bit ahead of ourselves with that. The other way that we can rename a view is just kind of the intuitive way, a slow double click. So we click once, wait a second, click again, and then it sort of puts it in edit mode. And we can just change that view to whatever we want. So the last thing we're going to demonstrate, and we're going to wrap this thing up, is creating new views. When we're going to create a new view, typically we're going to do that from the View tab, and there's all kinds of different views that we can create here. And each one sort of has a drop down. So for plan views, for example, we can do just a regular floor plan. We can do a ceiling plan. We can do a plan region, a few other things. Same thing with elevation. It's got a couple different options there. But when we're creating 3D views, we can create these default 3D views like we've been looking at, which are parallel perspective. You can see that all the lines are running parallel to each other, are the same distance apart. Let me demonstrate what that looks like in a 3D view that is not parallel. This is what we would call perspective view. And we're going to go ahead and switch to this Pool House 3D. That's actually not a perspective view. This one's a perspective view. I'm going to go ahead and just go back to floor one. We're going to create a new 3D view in here, and we're going to do that using the camera tool. So the camera tool basically allows us to plant the camera in a place. We're going to click to place the camera, and then it's going to ask us to place the target, or in other words, which direction the camera is pointed. So I'm going to drag that all the way through. You can see it gives you a preview of the camera's field of view, and we're going to click again. And let's go ahead and take a look at what this 3D view we just created looks like. So you can kind of see that the lines that are actually parallel in the world are showing as converging on one another. And they call that a perspective, or in this case it would be like a 2 or a 3 point perspective. All of these lines that are parallel, these mullions on this window, are all sort of coming down and they're ending up at a point out here in space, right? So just be familiar with that. And then this is kind of where sometimes this 3D navigation wheel comes in handy for fine-tuning these types of views. Right? You can kind of click and drag and adjust where that view is looking a little bit easier than you could using other methods. So we will practice using some of these other drawing and editing tools in the coming chapters, but for now, just become familiar with the navigation of the views and throughout Revit's user interface, and just kind of try to build a little bit of muscle memory for that. All right, reach out with any questions you may have, and we'll see you next time.